Bien, buenas.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you who are here in Madrid and all those of you who are following us online. Welcome to this event today in Fundación Telefónica within the framework of all the events we have around the Brains, Cerebros exhibition. You can visit the exhibition here in this venue until June 25th this year. And I encourage you all to visit the exhibition because it's wonderful. Today, I'm very lucky. It's really a privilege for me to be talking to one of the people who know the most about our brain, the organ that we could say that is the one that makes us human, but also the most mysterious one, the one that we know less about, Anil Seth. He's one of the most important researchers in the world in neuroscience, in the science of conscience. He's a professor of computational science in Sussex University. He's a co-director of conscience science there. And you've probably watched his TED Talk about how your brain hallucinates your conscious reality. And he's the author of several books in neuroscience. I really recommend all these books, and he's going to present this one today, another book published by Sexto Piso and recognized as one of the best books of the year by many different media, El País, Babelia, the Financial Times. Once we finish with this event, it's going to take us around an hour. Anil and I will talk around 40 minutes. Then we'll have some minutes where we will open the floor for the audience. And then you will have the chance to buy the book outside, and Anil will be available for you to sign those books. So I invite you to stay after our talk. And I would like to start by asking Anil. I would like to ask you something that everybody asks you all the time. I know probably you are already bored about answering the same question. But before I ask you that question, you want to talk in Spanish. I understand.
Un poco, pero solo quiero decir.
I just want to say that it is a pleasure to be here in Madrid. I was here many years ago, but this is a great city and it's a little bit too hot, but at least it's better than in England. And my Spanish is not enough to speak about the brain. It's just good for going out for dinner and speaking about beer. So I'll be listening to this magical machine to get the translation, and then I'll switch to English. So the question.
En español.
Great, perfect. Then I'll keep talking in Spanish. What is conscience? Consciousness. What is it for you?
It's one of the big philosophical and scientific mysteries, but it's also something we're all very familiar with. People struggle to define it precisely, but we all know what it is. Consciousness is what you lose when you fall into a dreamless sleep or go under general anesthesia, and it's what returns when you come back from anesthesia or wake up in the morning. And when you do wake up and you open your eyes, then stuff comes into your brain, but there's more than just information processing happening. There's experience too. You open your eyes, and there's a quality of color and shape and object. And if you feel thirsty, it's not that your body just does things like make a coffee. No, you feel thirst. Consciousness is exactly that. It's any kind of experience whatsoever. It's the thing that makes us more than just being complicated objects that move around in the subjective darkness.
Uh-huh. ¿Y cómo se...
And how does that form, in which way that consciousness forms in a human being like me or like you?
Well, consciousness, I think it's not just one thing. And there's this temptation to think of consciousness as like a single, big, scary mystery. There'll be some eureka solution. But it's actually many things that come together in a particular way in human beings. So we can think of how conscious we are at any particular moment. This might be the difference between, again, something like anesthesia or sleep and being alert and awake as we are now, or other altered states of consciousness, maybe under hypnosis or in psychedelics or something. They're all global states. And then when we are conscious, we're conscious of something. There's the world around us with all its people and places and objects and colors and sounds and smells. And the brain creates this. It's not just there. We actively generate the world that we experience. The world itself is real, but the way we experience it, I think we'll discuss, is the creation. And then within that, and this is what the book really is ultimately about, is the experience of being a self. And this is the aspect of consciousness that I think many of us cling to most closely. The experience of being an individual, the person that we are, with the body that we have, the emotions that we feel, the sense of agency over our actions and our thoughts, the idea, the feeling that we have free will, which is another tricky one, free will. And then the sense of being a continuous person over time. All of these things come together to define what the experience of being a human being is like. Mm-hmm. But the argument that I develop in the book and the way the research that I've been doing leads is that it's all basically the same principle. The self is not something separate that lives inside your skull, that looks out through your eyes and listens through your ears. The self is a kind of perception too. It's just another aspect of this ongoing flow of experience that characterizes every waking moment of every life.
En el libro, de hecho,
Actually, in the book, you start by talking about that moment beyond our dream, anesthesia, right? A moment when our consciousness disconnects completely. You say it's the art of making people become objects. I really like that. I like that definition because it's true that with all of us have gone through anesthesia. We've felt that, but where does consciousness go when we fall in that kind of sleep, when we become an object? Where does it go?
It goes away, doesn't it? It doesn't go into another room or just sort of in the waiting room with the family. It's completely gone, but it is an amazing, I used to call it's an amazing experience, but it's not, because that's the point. There is no experience at all. And I've had general anesthesia a few times, and I highly recommend it if you haven't had general anesthesia. It's a very interesting sort of philosophical experiment to do on yourself. I don't really recommend it, but just to be safe. Unlike sleep, in sleep you can feel that you're gone for a while, but actually you're never really gone in sleep, or only very rarely. And when you wake up, you know that some amount of time has passed. It could be 5 minutes, or it could be a few hours, but you're not going to be that wrong. But in anesthesia, it's totally different. If it's deep enough, you are gone and then you are back, and nothing happened in the middle. The ends join up. And it could have been 5 minutes, or it could have been 5 years. It would be the same to you. You just were not there. And that, for me, as we said, it's a very good definition of consciousness, because in that time, you are just an object. And actually, I've been to witness people having anesthesia too. And even from the outside, it's really quite extraordinary. You look at these people and they look, they have life to them, and then suddenly they turn into objects. That's what it looks like externally too. Consciousness is gone. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just gone. And then, of course, the real magic of anesthesia is that it comes back. But in this, I think it's both one of the most significant inventions of the 20th century. I would not want to live in a world without anesthesia. Yeah. But it's also just a wonderful window into the biology of consciousness, because now it's no longer a philosophical issue only. We can turn consciousness on and off in a living brain and see what happens, and that's one of the ways that consciousness research can progress in the lab.
¿Y qué hay de
And what about sleep? About us sleeping, because it's also fascinating for me. We've accepted that during 8 hours a day, those who are lucky enough, unfortunately I don't sleep that long every day, but during 8 hours a day, you're going to be outside of this world, right? Not with anesthesia, you wake up and that's it. But what happens when we are, during those hours, when we are voluntarily away, we disappear voluntarily from the world?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's voluntarily when we sleep, and we have to sleep. Sleeping is, if you think about it, it's an incredibly risky thing for animals to do, because they're very vulnerable when they're asleep. So there must be a real benefit to it, otherwise evolution would have made us just be continually awake. And there's been a lot of discussion about the functions of sleep, and of course sleep itself is not one thing, just as consciousness is not one thing. There are many different stages and forms of sleep. The most well-known are the distinction between rapid eye movement sleep, which is when most vivid dreams happen, but also, and then there's this slow wave sleep where consciousness is mainly gone. But it turns out dreams happen then too. If you wake people up in these other stages of sleep, often they report that something is happening. It may be simple stuff like a single phrase or a single visual image, but we're rarely totally unconscious when we're asleep. And what's it for? Well, I think it's for many different purposes for different stages, but there's one. So the slow wave sleep seems to be, at least in part, about cleaning out the brain. It's sort of it's dealing with all the build-up of chemicals that happen in the day, normalizing it in a way, bringing it back down. And why consciousness goes away in this situation, this is something very interesting, because sleep turns out at the level of activity in the brain, you still see activity, but then every second or so it just completely goes quiet, and it's that interruption. It's as if the brain is continually coming to again and then forgetting, and there's no continuity over time in the activity of the brain, and so therefore there's no continuity in our sense of experience in these stages of sleep. And dreaming, I mean, people have also wondered about dreams, well, Freud, and then of course long before. And the idea about dreams that I find really, really compelling is that when we're dreaming, it's basically the brain tuning, calibrating its models of how the world works so that we can perceive the world better the next day. But it is remarkable, if you look across different animal species, you see so much variety in how animals sleep. Some sleep with half their brains at a time. Migratory birds, if they have to keep flying, they, half the brain sleeps, the other half keeps things going in the air, and they take turns. And and some newborn seals don't sleep at all for the first however many months of their life. There's a huge amount of evolutionary tuning. So it's not just that the brain shuts off for a while, it's a crucially active part of our mental lives.
Bueno, todo este debate sobre la...
So, and all this discussion about consciousness brings us to wonder about reality. Does reality exist as we think about it, or it's just millions of realities? You talk in your book about a controlled hallucination. Does reality exist?
Alucinación controlada. It's a very tricky phrase.
Yeah.
So the reason I like to use this phrase is that it brings to light, it surfaces something which I think is, in one sense, obvious, but in another sense, totally counterintuitive about the way we experience the world. It seems to us that we experience the world just as it is. We open our eyes and it seems as if the world just pours itself into our minds through the windows of our eyes and our ears. and that our brain doesn't seem to have much to do with it. But the truth is very different. Take color, this nice blue color of the book, or the beautiful pink on your dress. Colors don't exist objectively in the world, and we don't need neuroscience for that. I mean, art and physics have told us that. Cézanne said, color is where the brain and the universe meet. Out there in the real world, well, you best ask a physicist, but, to a first approximation, it's just radiation, energy. And when it comes to color, our brains, well, our eyes are only sensitive to just 3 wavelengths of this vast spectrum of energy. So in that sense, what we experience is less than what's really there. But of course, we experience more than 3 colors. We experience millions of colors. And so we experience both less than and more than what's really there. And I think that's true for color. It's also true for everything else. The philosopher Kant, I think, is a good reference point because he made it a very strong argument that it doesn't even make sense to say we could experience reality as it is. It's always hidden behind a sensory veil. Everything we experience is an interpretation, and it comes from the inside out rather than the outside in, even though it seems like it comes from the outside in. So yes, the reason this alucinación controlada is useful is because it emphasizes that our experience is generated from within, but it's controlled. And that's critical. It's not arbitrary. It depends on the world. So our perceptual best guesses, our perceptual interpretations are tuned to the world. Evolution has made damn sure of that. They're tuned to the world in ways that are useful for us to survive. So we see the world not as it is, but in ways that it is useful for us to do so. And of course, because we all have slightly different brains, just as we all differ in skin color and height and body shape, we're all going to experience even the same shared reality in slightly different ways. And that can be very hard to recognize, because it seems as though we see things as they are, and sometimes the differences can be very slight. So we use the same words, we gloss over the differences with language, and we never quite realize that, in fact, yes, we each inhabit a distinctive, personalized little bubble of subjectivity.
¿Y cómo funciona ese?
And how does that control work? We talk about controlled hallucination. How are we able to control that hallucination?
So we don't do the controlling. Our brain does the controlling, and we are a result of that, I think. And so this is what a lot of the day-to-day research in my group is about, and lots of other groups too. And the idea is that imagine being your brain. You are your own brain, and you're trying to figure out what's going on out there in the world. And all you have to go on are just these ambiguous signals, just light waves and pressure waves and so on, that don't come with any labels attached. You've got to make sense of it. And so this, in mathematics, in philosophy, in logic, is a problem of inference. The brain has to make its best guess given uncertain information. And the way that it does that, or the theory that I explore in the book, and it's a very old theory, it's not my own theory, is that the brain combines its prior knowledge, pre-existing knowledge of the way things work, like light comes from above generally, and solid things remain solid. It uses that prior knowledge to interpret the sensory signals. And so the brain is continually making predictions about what's out there and in here in the body, making these predictions, and then it uses the sensory data to update these predictions. And there's a single process that the brain is always doing, which is trying to minimize these prediction errors. It's trying to basically explain away the sensory data, because then its predictions match reality in some way. And that's, my view is, that is what we experience. We experience the content of the brain's predictions, not the sensory data. That's just used to keep our predictions tuned to the world. So another literary reference point for this is Anais Nin, who said that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And it's this process of the brain continually probing. It's a very active probing of our environment and of our body that's totally, we're not aware that this is happening. No, we are only aware of the output, and part of the output is in fact this sense of being a self, of being a person.
Pero es curioso.
But it's funny. One of the most striking things when you reflect upon these things, when you read the book, is that in spite of all those million of hallucinations, of controlled hallucinations that we are, all of us, at the end of the day, we live in societies, in communities, families, countries, and there are rules, right? Even universal rules that allow us to live in among those million of controlled hallucinations. How did we get there? How did we get to that point where we can share those common rules, and in spite of each of us having our own hallucination?
I think our experiences are not totally different from each other. Again, they're controlled, and they're controlled by the world that we share. So evolution has made, again, very sure that for most of us, our experiences of the world are going to be pretty similar. And we will use language to bridge the differences so we don't even notice them. So I don't think there's a huge problem, which is why when people have uncontrolled hallucinations, such as in psychiatric conditions, in schizophrenia, in psychosis, or in other conditions, or following brain injury, then we notice, because they still have experiences of the world, and they may in some ways be similar, but now this carefully calibrated process of keeping the brain's predictions tied to the world, that's gone wrong in some way, and now perception becomes inadequate in some way. It becomes problematic, it becomes challenging. Of course, there's a lot of grey area here too. People talk about neurodiversity, which is recognizing that people can experience the world differently, but it's wrong to call that a condition or worse. It's just difference. But the fact is, we're all different. It's not just at the extremes of neurodiversity. We're all different, but we may not differ by that much. In fact, we have a new study which you can all help with. Maybe it's called the Perception Census, which is really trying to measure for the first time at a very large scale how different our inner lives really are, just in terms of things like color and time and sound and music. Because we can use this to actually cultivate a broader recognition that in fact we do see things in different ways from each other, and that I think can provide a stronger platform for communication and for empathy, and maybe breaking out of some of the echo chambers in which we live. So we're both trying to use it as a way of conveying this message, but also collecting the evidence to see the extent to which it's the case.
And in your book, we see how we have different selves, each of us. So how many selves are in Anil?
Well, ser o estar. It's complicated.
Complicated.
When translating the book, apparently there was a big discussion about which Spanish verb to use, the more permanent ser or the more temporary estar. I think we have many aspects of the self. I mean, there are certain conditions, again in psychiatry, like dissociative identity disorder, where people can feel they have multiple personalities. That's not what I talk about in the book. I rather want to highlight that what we perceive or experience generally as being a unified, continuous self. Like, I am Anil Seth, I feel like I'm the same person over time, and it feels like there's just one me. But there's many separate aspects to that. There's the experience of the body. This object is my body, this table is not. I feel emotions and moods that somehow come from within the body. I have this experience of a first-person perspective. I can see the world from a particular point of view, which is usually right here. I have agency and free will, and then I have identity and social self, and I haven't been keeping count. So how many is that? I don't know. Like, there's already quite a few aspects of self that we experience as being unified. And again, that long ago, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, talked about the self as a bundle of perceptions, and I think he was largely on the right track. And all I've been doing, adding to that story a little bit, is showing a continuity between how those aspects of self are underpinned by the same mechanisms by which we experience the outside world. So there are many selves, but it doesn't matter, because in a sense they are all bound together. But you know, we can, in the lab, one of the fun things we can do is we can tease them apart. So we can begin to dissect out these different contributions to what being a human self consists in.
Me gustaría explicar.
I would like you to explain a little bit how you decided to dedicate your life to research about consciousness. There are some anecdotes in the book, but I would like you to tell us why you started studying this.
I'm going to dedicate my life to this. I thought I might do other more fun things as well. No, it is very fun. I feel very privileged to do it, but honestly it just sort of happened. You never understand life in advance only. But I think, like, I do remember being a relatively small child. I don't have a very good memory, but it was always something I was interested in. I think for every child there's a point where certain questions arise. Why am I me? You know, where was I before I was born? What will happen when I die? I think everyone asks these questions, but we normally grow out of them and end up doing something more useful, or get educated out of them at school. And I somehow never did. And these questions just kept bugging me over many years, as being both great mysteries, but also deeply personal mysteries. And there are very few things like that, I think, in our lives these days, where the very overarching intersects with the deeply personal. That attracted to me. And I was also very lucky that the study of consciousness through most of the last century was considered rather disreputable, fringe, maybe philosophy, maybe religion, but if you wanted to be a neuroscientist or a psychologist, you better not use the C word and study consciousness. But that began to change around the mid-1990s when I was a student. And the development of brain imaging methods, so we can look inside the living human brain while people are having conscious experiences or losing them in anesthesia, that helped. And this redevelopment of just ways we could actually study it in the lab, it rehabilitated consciousness, because it wasn't always like that. When psychology was emerging as a science, and neuroscience with Ramón y Cajal here in the late 19th century, consciousness was the central question. Obviously, you know, that's what we should understand. There's this amazing everyday miracle happening as a result of just a bunch of neurons doing their stuff. And so it was nice to see it come back. It's still fairly disreputable, but it's now possible to study it and work on it without completely cutting yourself off. And it brings together, the other thing I love about it is it brings together so many disciplines. One of the things I really worried about having a career in science was that you would end up focusing on one thing that was so specialized that you would know everything about this one thing and nobody else would care about it at all. But consciousness isn't like that. It's so broad, and it's been a delight that, you know, to really understand consciousness, you need to bring together neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, mathematics, also the humanities, you know, the arts, music, sociology has a lot to say. Anthropology has a great deal to say. And of course, you can't be expert in all of these, but it feels like a privilege to be able to still keep learning from these different interactions.
¿Y cómo puede ayudar?
And how can the consciousness science help what you're studying in your center with conditions of the brain, Alzheimer, for example, which is one of the most cruel illnesses we know about, because you lose your consciousness little by little. How can your research processes help with all these diseases?
It's slow, unfortunately. I wish things were faster. When I set up the centre at Sussex with my colleague, who's a psychiatrist, we set it up in 2010. The hope was that by now there'd be a real transformation in psychiatry. It hasn't happened, but it's happening. And I'll come to Alzheimer's in a minute, but the most obvious in medical area, the most obvious application is in things like psychiatry. Because in psychiatry, we are quite limited in what we can do. There are talking therapies. It can be very effective, but they're limited. And there are drugs that you can take, but the drugs mainly just work on suppressing the symptoms. They don't get at the causes. It's as if we have the equivalent of paracetamol for psychiatry, but we don't have the equivalent of an antiviral or an antibiotic or a vaccine or anything like that. And I think if you think about what a psychiatric condition is, it's often people focus on the behavior of somebody, but really it's at heart, it's usually a change in the way they experience the world and the self. And if you can understand that, then you're getting closer to understanding the mechanisms. And of course, that's necessary in order to have something like a psychiatric antibiotic. And there are clues like this idea of the way we experience being a controlled hallucination. Well, that provides a very attractive, compelling way to think about some psychiatric conditions. When that balance goes wrong in specific ways, then you get specific kinds of altered perception. So we currently in my lab are working on understanding the different kinds of visual hallucinations that people have in psychosis, in Parkinson's disease, in psychedelics, and they're all different. And by getting down to the mechanisms, then we can learn more about both normal perception, but also really what's happening in these conditions. Alzheimer's is really difficult. I mean, it's so many people are trying to understand what's happening in these neurodegenerative conditions, but I do think it's the case that people look at it often as a problem of memory or a problem of behavior, and not so often through the lens of the conscious experience of the person with Alzheimer's. So I have a colleague in Cambridge who's really trying to adapt methods that we have for studying conscious experience to people at varying stages of Alzheimer's and dementia to understand how their experience is changing, because it's much more than just the loss of memory. Many other things, as anybody knows who knows people with Alzheimer's or dementia. Like there's so many changes, and the changes are confusing, because in some sense the person still seems to be the same person, but in other senses they change, which comes back to this idea of the self as not a thing, but a bundle of perceptions that is always changing. And we're changing too. It's just that we don't normally notice the change very often.
Usted lleva unos 20 años.
You've been researching about this for 20 years. What is the most striking thing that you've learned about, the most shocking thing that you've learned from all this research?
That's a very difficult question.
I know.
I mean, it's to be very honest, sometimes when I wake up I think, oh my God, we still don't understand anything. It's been a total waste of time. It does feel like that sometimes. But then on sunnier days, I think, okay, what did our picture of consciousness look like 30 years ago? And it's very different. There's been a lot of progress, but it hasn't been a single big eureka. It's not like an Einstein has come along and given us a new equivalent of relativity or quantum mechanics or something like that. Biology is messy, and the brain seems to be particularly messy. Certainly in my lab, we've had no sort of massive eureka moments. It's been a lot of things just slowly changing. I think so I would say two things. One thing that really hit home with me was just this idea that perceptual experience is a kind of brain-based prediction. Not a new idea, but just when that single idea just united so many different things, from how neurons work to how we understand psychology, to how our daily experiences, to how psychiatric conditions happen, to how artificial intelligence works too. It brought together so many things that felt for me like, yes, now this is on the right track. The other thing I think is a place I didn't expect to get to in the book, which is that, like most neuroscientists, I started off thinking mainly about how we experience the world and senses like vision, and thinking of the brain as a little bit like a computer that the body carries around from one meeting to another. But exploring this idea that our experiences are always perceptual predictions that are rooted in the body made me realize there might be a very, very intimate connection between mind, consciousness, and life. That consciousness is not a software program that the brain is running, but it's a deeply embodied phenomenon that depends on our nature as flesh and blood animals. And this is still, it's not something you can demonstrate with an experiment, but it's where, for me, a lot of evidence is pointing. And I think for me I didn't expect to get there, and that's one of the beautiful things also about science, is that you can end up somewhere that you really didn't predict, and then you feel you've learned something.
Volveré a preguntar dentro de otros 20 años.
In 20 years from now, I'll ask you again. You've mentioned artificial intelligence. Obviously, it's a big topic right now. I don't know, I guess you've had the chance to talk to experts in this field. It feels like it's conscious, right? Will we reach a moment when artificial intelligence has consciousness?
In fact, it's a strong interest. In fact, my PhD was in artificial intelligence, so I was very, I've always been on the interface of AI and neuroscience. And when I finished my PhD, it was in one of these so-called artificial intelligence winters. So no one thought it was working very well, and it was a really bad time if you wanted to make money and set up a company. So my students now who do AI, they're just like whoosh, they go off, and they're very much in demand. But the type of AI that I was always interested in is the type that is, in some sense, modeled on the brain. We have these artificial neural networks that now are extremely powerful. Back when I was doing this kind of work, there was always this idea that if we only had more data and faster computers and tweak things a bit, that things would get really powerful. And no one really believed that at the time, but it seems to be true that now, with insanely more powerful machines and much more data, suddenly it works. There's a kind of an unreasonable effectiveness in contemporary AI of just having a huge amount of data and a lot of compute. But does this mean consciousness comes along? I don't think so. And I don't think so for a few reasons. Firstly, we struggle, I think, with the residue of human exceptionalism. So we humans, over history, have always tended to see things through a human lens and put ourselves at the center of everything, at the top of every pile. And historically, this has meant that when we think about consciousness, we closely associate it with intelligence. We think we're smart, although the state of the world suggests we're probably not as smart as we think we are. And we know we're conscious, so we think the things go together, and we might attribute consciousness to other systems based on their intelligence. People have done that with non-human animals, for instance. And this leads to the assumption in and around the AI community that consciousness might just come along once AI gets to a certain threshold, which is, weirdly enough, apparently when it gets as intelligent as humans, which I think gives you a clue about the sort of arbitrariness of this reasoning. But consciousness and intelligence are very different things. Intelligence is very, very broadly the ability to do the right thing at the right time, maybe to make goal-directed actions and have plans and so on, but really just doing the right thing. the right time. And consciousness is about having experience. And the most basic forms of experience are things like emotions, pain, pleasure, good, bad. You don't have to be very smart as a species for those kinds of emotions to be useful. So for me, it's just a relic of human hubris to think that intelligence will just emerge as things get smarter. But what I think will happen, and also, if consciousness is indeed really related to our nature as living systems, then maybe it's just not the kind of thing that a computer could ever have. It might always only just be a simulation of consciousness. I mean, if we have computers simulating weather, which of course we all rely on these computers that are telling us how long the heat wave in Madrid is going to last, when it's next going to rain, all whirring away in computers. It never gets wet or windy, or the heat wave never actually happens in the computer. And we're not confused by that. It's like, okay, that's only ever a simulation. But somehow people assume that for consciousness it's different, and that the simulation will actually create the thing itself. Now, for some things that's true. Playing chess, that's true. Computer that plays chess. So is consciousness more like the weather, or is it more like chess? And I think it's probably more like the weather, that it depends on the actual stuff. So those are the reasons why I don't think it's around the corner. But what I do think is happening now. We can see this with these chatbots, these large language models that certainly people may have played around with ChatGPT. They play on our anthropomorphic bias. We can't help projecting into them. Like, it seems to understand. Very otherwise sensible people I know have said things like this. It understands. It has a theory of mind. It doesn't. It doesn't understand anything. It doesn't know anything. It's certainly not conscious, but it will seem that way to us. And even that, I think, is already posing a large challenge for society, because we've never had a situation like this where we share our worlds with systems that we know, or we know exactly what they're doing, yet we can't help project human qualities into them. This is confusing for us, because it will change what we trust, it will change what we feel we have ethical obligations towards, it will make us vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation, all kinds of things. So even, there are two things to worry about. We should worry about both, but we should not confuse the two.
It's funny, I was listening to you, and I remember an article that was published by the New York Times a few weeks ago, where they said that artificial intelligence were going to end up being have consciousness, if they had a physical body that they could interact with. If that happened, it's what you were saying, right? A big part of that consciousness is built by our body itself. So if that ChatGPT had a physical body and it was interacting with the world, could that happen?
I think it changes things, but it doesn't change everything. It gets a little more subtle here, but let's say you put ChatGPT in a robot, like the robot in Cerebro here, and it goes marching around. The problem with this is that the ChatGPT, it didn't grow up in the body. It's just trained in the abstract, and you just plug it in. So that's like taking a brain that's developed in a vat and plugging it in, Frankenstein-like, to a body. That probably is not enough. So the first thing is you need to train the network in a thing. That's never going to happen, because that's not the way these training things work. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's a very poor simulacra of a body. So the robots that we tend to have, they can interact a little bit with the world, but they don't have an interior that they care about. The argument in the book that I make is really fundamentally our brains do what they do because of this biological imperative to keep the body alive, to regulate the internal physiology, blood pressure, heartbeats, oxygenation, all these things. A robot just has a battery, and it may sense it in some way, but its brain was not designed or evolved to keep it going. And there's still this big separation between the brain and the body, which we don't have. You know, for us, the brain was part of the body. But even if you solved all of those things, like, there's an interesting possibility here, which is, I think, a chat GPT made of silicon that grew up in a body, it may truly understand things, because I think understanding is grounded in our physical interactions. That's ultimately why words mean things. Ultimately, it's grounded in physical embodied interactions. And for us, understanding kind of goes along with consciousness. We consciously understand things. But maybe for this embodied chat GPT that grew up in a robot body, it would understand truly, but it would still not be conscious. And so I quite like these technologies for this reason, that they break some of our assumptions apart. I mean, it's not, maybe other people have thought about this, but I hadn't thought about it this way, that, okay, maybe understanding and consciousness need not always go together, and maybe in AI, that's where the future will be.
Voy a hacer una última pregunta antes de dar...
One last question before opening the floor for the audience. One of the main topics in the book and this talk today is that consciousness is not related to intelligence, but to the fact of being alive, of being a living being. And this brings us to a question that is essential for me. I don't know about other people, but for me, animals, or other animals that share the planet with us, do they have a consciousness?
Fundamental, sí.
Yes, but it's very hard to know exactly where one draws the line. And yes, there is this legacy of endowing other animals with consciousness based on their superficial similarity to humans. But attitudes have changed so much over the years. Like, when I was researching for this book, one of the things that I was totally confounded and amazed by was that in the Middle Ages, animals had legal rights and were criminally prosecuted. So pigs would be taken to court if they bit a child, and rats would be taken to court if they infested a house, and they would have defense lawyers. And occasionally they would get let off because of previous good character and other crazy things like that. So this idea that we have more recently, that consciousness kind of fades away as we get further from the human, that was not always the way. And I think once we really take on board that consciousness is not primarily about intelligence, it opens our minds to the possibility that consciousness suffuses our world much more broadly than we might think. It may not be everywhere, but it's going to be in many, many different animals. All mammals, we all have very similar brain structures. So for me, there's no doubt that all mammals have some kind of conscious experience. It won't be the same as ours, obviously, but it'll be some kind. Beyond then, it gets interesting. I think birds, probably, but then I spent a week with octopuses some years ago. Extremely interesting, because the evolutionary path is so different. Our last common ancestor was 600 million years ago, some kind of crappy little worm, and two totally independent experiments, evolutionary experiments in mind. And if an octopus is conscious, I kind of assume that it is, its experience of the world and of being itself, being pulpo, ser pulpo, no sé, is going to be just different in a way that again makes us question what we should take for granted about our own experience. Octopuses have more neurons in their arms collectively than in their central brain. So the octopus might not even have a conception of where its body is, whereas we just know this. Might have a self-experience that's a bit more like a cloud. Very, very difficult to know. But I think it speaks to the fact that studying consciousness is not some sort of armchair scientific philosophical luxury thing to do where we can just revel in the grand mysteries of the world. It has enormous practical relevance. We've spoken about psychiatry, we've spoken about AI, and we now speak about animal welfare, and there's also the law too, where we understand more about the basis of free will that has enormous implications. The legal systems are having to change and change rapidly to adapt to the emerging understanding of voluntary behavior and free will. So it's exciting, and perceptual difference as well, and there's other things. Yeah, I think that's got a lot of practical implications. So yes, it's great, consciousness.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Anil. Now we will have some Q&A session around 10 minutes. I would like you to be very specific and brief, okay, if you can, so we can give the floor to anyone with a question. I don't know, over there? Okay, be very brief, okay?
Consciousness is a result of a complexity of an organism, right? But from some philosophical points of view, what makes the difference between our consciousness and other type of consciousness is our capacity of being conscious of our conscious.
Yeah.
We can be thinking about something at the same time, apprehend these thoughts and think about thoughts at the same time that we're thinking them. So that's a very I don't know if you would agree with that. Apparently there's no evidence that can happen with other animals.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you would agree with that point of view. And the second question would be, have you experimented? Have you had some practical experiences of that in your laboratory? Have you got into that? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the question. I'm assuming that was also available in Spanish, that question.
Yeah.
So there's this capacity that humans certainly have, which we call metacognition. And we take it for granted again. Like we have experiences, but we know we have experiences. And the two generally go together. Like I have a look at this book. I know I'm having the experience of looking at a book. We can reflect on our experiences. So indeed, there are some theories of consciousness that say, this is the mechanism. This is how I don't agree. I don't buy into those theories. I think they're a bit of a legacy of being overly biased by what we think is special about humans. And the evidence for it, there is some evidence, but we're at the stage in this science where basically there's evidence for and against every theory that's out there, which makes it both exciting and confusing. So the empirical, and we've done some of this work to your second question, so we do work a little bit on metacognition, but mainly to figure out how it works, not to make any grand claims about consciousness. And so I think, given that other animals can do this to some extent, it's hard to assess, but there's ways to do it, certainly in monkeys and in crows and in other species. But I wouldn't interpret the absence of metacognition as the absence of consciousness.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Another question over there. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Anil, very much. It was very interesting. Two questions. First, related to the counterintuitive term that you mentioned. What's the difference between all the discoveries by David Hume in the 18th century? He, in a counterintuitive way, he used to say that consciousness was an illusion. An illusion doesn't mean that it didn't exist, just that it's not what it seems to be. So what are the advances, the progress since that? And then about mythology related to Pindaro. Tell us a little bit, how are those conversations with consciousness, which are, I guess, conversations with yourself?
Okay, I'll come back to the second question. I'm not sure I fully got that. The first one, what progress has there been since David Hume? In a sense, conceptually, I would say limited. I mean, a lot of the, I think, the ideas that are present now have all been around for a long time. But it's not only Hume. I mean, so Kant again said a lot of this stuff. The Arabian scholar Ibn al-Haytham came up with the idea of perception as inference. Even Plato says something a little bit like this. I think the advances have been in giving these philosophical arguments some empirical traction. So we now, it's not just a conclusion we reach on the basis of abstract reasoning or introspection. We can demonstrate that these processes are happening, and we understand the mechanisms, and we can unify them across many different scales of explanation. So there's a mathematics that underwrites what Hume says, which wasn't available at the time, and that mathematics helps us bring together. We didn't talk about this because nobody wants me to start talking in equations, but there's a mathematics that really links this idea of the brain as a prediction machine and this idea that it's all fundamentally rooted in regulation of the body, the mathematics that links thermodynamics and information theory and so on. So there's a much richer picture now. But I don't think, Hume's fundamental insights still stand. To me anyway, they do.
Sí, y la segunda pregunta era sobre Píndaro.
And the second question about Pindarus. Yes, the conversations we have, the second part of the question, Pindarus, the poet Pindarus, who talked about who we are. And so obviously I just wanted to know your opinion about those conversations with yourself or with your consciousness to become a leader and become who you are, and not just more of an open question, this one.
Yeah, so I think, let me answer it this way, that I think spending so many years studying and thinking about these things, it can't help change you. So I do have this internal dialogue that maybe it's a very unhealthy internal dialogue that's continually saying, who are you? Are you anybody? Do you exist? But actually I think it's really quite a healthy thing. In many ways, I think when you really bake in and automate these habits of questioning how things seem and how they relate to how things are, it's a little bit like what I think people might get after lots of meditation. Now, I'm not claiming it's the same thing. I have not the discipline to do 10,000 hours of meditation, and I wouldn't claim to have equivalent insights that can be gained from that. But there's a similarity in the kind of work that it can do for you, because you can begin to recognize the passing of your own thoughts and emotions and moods and perceptions as simultaneously, you still experience them as I still see colors out there in the world I still feel happy and sad and angry and frustrated. But there's another level where you realize that these are at the same time, they're just my mind doing its thing. And I think there's great benefit to that. I think it allows us to know ourselves a bit better and navigate the inevitable ups and downs of life with a little bit more equanimity. But maybe that's just me being optimistic.
Tenemos una última oportunidad.
We have one last question that we can take here, first row, to change a little bit. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Anil. I wanted to ask you, in the same way that we understand that in nature we have different degrees of intelligence, we say that a turtle is more intelligent than a mosquito and a dog is more intelligent than a turtle. In the same way, can we find that as well in consciousness? I mean, are there different degrees established? I don't know, maybe depending on their complexity, or they're just really just different? And if your answer is yes, can we guess that in the future we will have a consciousness that is more complex than the one we have as human beings, for example?
So, yes, there's this idea that there's this kind of scale, right? And in fact, the idea of a scale is very, very old. Back in medieval times, there was this great chain of being that went from rocks to plants to animals, to humans, to angels, to gods. And it's a very tempting way to organize our picture of nature, but I think it's fundamentally misleading. Only certain things in the universe work like that. Things like temperature, for sure. Temperature is on a single scale. And when you understand that, we really know what temperature is. Other things might look like they are, but that's partly because we deliberately blur our vision of the phenomenon. So yeah, there's a sense in which a turtle is more intelligent than a mosquito, but there's many things mosquitoes do that are pretty smart that turtles can't do. And the same with every comparison you want to make. So yes, there's some kind of globality. There has to be. And you might say, well, that's in the flexibility of behavior, and maybe in that case there's a certain scale, but there's always exceptions. And intelligence, I think, is really multidimensional. It's not one thing, which is why IQ tests, there's such a controversy. What do IQ tests measure? Well, they measure IQ. They're very circular. They don't really measure intelligence, only if you assume that intelligence is IQ. And so I think the same goes, in fact, it goes probably more so for consciousness. Again, we have some global changes which seem obvious within where we started this conversation. Sleep is less conscious than wake. That is generally true, though dreaming is an exception. Psychedelics is another exception. It's not a higher state, it's a different state. So I think one of the challenges, and this is something we're working on right now, and others, is what are the best dimensions? If there's not a single scale, what are the best dimensions that can characterize the variability in possible states of consciousness, both the ones we encounter in our everyday lives, but also the ones that are more unusual, like in psychiatry, like in psychedelics, like the various things we can do in the lab. And identifying those, I think, will take us away from this tempting idea of putting things on a single scale. And for this reason, I also resist the idea in the future we will become more conscious. I think we'll become differently conscious, and it's not always good. I mean, we struggle with we're certainly conscious in different ways already than even a generation ago. If you look at the size of social groups that we have and the way we interact, so the social aspects of our conscious experience has changed enormously in a very short amount of time. And of course, with modern technologies, we can even start to give ourselves new senses by plugging things into our brains and making sure that our brains adapt to them. So there's a lot that we have to think about in society, because we are at a point now where we are going to develop pretty sophisticated abilities to control conscious experiences. So back to your thing, whereas for most of evolutionary history, we didn't control our controlled hallucinations. I think in the future, we already do this with coffee and with wine and with beer and with drugs, but we might be able to do it in a more precise way to become the authors of our own lived experience. And with that comes a great deal of responsibility, but it doesn't make us more conscious. It just gives us more ways in which we might mess things up.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Ya lo lamento porque
I'm sorry because we lost track of time. There were many people raising their hands, but I'm really sorry. I apologize because we don't have more time. I thank you, all those of you who were here with us today. And Neil will be signing his books if you want to meet him and talk to him. And thank you to all of you here and to the people following us on streaming. And Neil was saying before, sometimes I wake up thinking that I've been researching about this for many years and I didn't learn anything. Well, obviously, when you read this book, you realize that yes, you've learned a lot, and we've learned a lot today as well. So thank you very much for this really valuable time, for sharing this time with us. I don't know if you want to say anything Spanish to say bye.
Preguntas para invitarme aquí para hablar con nosotros en Madrid.
For the invitation to be here in Madrid and to spend a great afternoon with you guys. It's been great. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.